TESOL Pop, Season 9, Episode 8. Hello and welcome to TESOL Pop, the mini podcast for busy teachers. My name is Laura, and joining me today to talk about decolonising the classroom is Dr Amina Douidi. What does racial bias look like in teaching, materials and assessment? And what actions can we take to address it? Amina addresses these questions and shares insights into the steps we can take to build a diverse, equitable and inclusive learning environment. Let's join the conversation where I asked Amina, how can we identify racial bias?
Racial bias is often conflated with disciplinary issues sometimes in the classroom. So you hear teachers speak about some students, for example, being undisciplined, unmanageable, being for example, too angry or too disturbing or too noisy or too something, to insert an adjective. And although these characteristics could be describing any child or any student from any race and ethnicity, the research actually shows that students who are from a systematically marginalized, a historically marginalized group are often associated with these adjectives, and often very negative ones, although we also talk about positive stereotypes when it comes to, for example, students who come from China, for instance. We talk about these biases related to their nationality, their race and ethnicity, with regard to how disciplined they are, or how good at maths they are, or how docile they could be. So those characteristics that we assign to students, we may do that because of their actual behavior in the classroom, and it's an actual observation. However, when you look at the research, you find that there is a huge tendency to associate certain behaviors with certain groups. Every year you have teachers saying it's always the same group of students who do the same kind of behavior. And that's where you want to stop and question, is it what I am observing? Is it truly because of what is happening in the classroom? Has nothing to do with race and ethnicity, but most of the time it has. And this bias comes from the society, comes from how the history has created hierarchies among people, and it gets articulated and translated in the classroom in a very systemic way.
I imagine this obviously affects then the students' perceptions of themselves if they have these impressions placed upon them from people as revered as teachers, as school environments where they spend a huge majority of their time. That can then shape students' perceptions of themselves and their direction that they may take if people are always putting them in a box of being, the positive or negative that you just mentioned, either good at maths or, a troublemaker. It can sometimes be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
100%, yes. Basically, the motto should be representation matters. And what I see, I can become. So, for example, in the context of the UK, you have Black and ethnic minorities, Asians, students of Muslim background, or any other minority religion background would also be considered historically marginalized or systemically marginalized. However, if you go to a different context, that's in Algeria, where I come from, that group would change according to the context and the history and demographic of that region, for instance. So the idea here is that the students who are from those marginalized or systemically marginalized groups usually get very less representation, especially positive representation, in the materials they use, in the curriculum, in the language that the classroom teacher uses as well. So everything around them would tell them that either they are invisible, or they do not matter, or they will not do something important in their life or in their future career. And this idea would, of course, impact how they behave in the classroom, also how they study, how they how much motivation they put into the work, and how much effort they could put into the work as well. What we are trying to do here is make the teachers aware of these systemic issues, but also their role in reinforcing this system of inequity. But we're not necessarily saying that teachers are bad people, are we?
I wonder, Amina, could we look at each of those segments that you mentioned, like the teaching, the materials, the assessment? You've already mentioned some examples of what racial bias can look like in each of these. Could you go over each one and then tell us what we can do to try and make the classroom and our practices more inclusive and supportive?
Sure. If we start with the materials, for instance, decolonizing the curriculum might sound as a big word, a big concept. So what we could rather do is think about what we teach in the context of English language teaching. For instance, if all our references are Shakespeare or white Europeans, that can be problematic. However, when we look at English as a global language and the contributions of people of color and of Black people, of Black writers in the global North or in the global South, that would make the curriculum much more representative of the reality that the student will be navigating in English, but also would acknowledge the contributions that have made wonderful Nobel Prizes that we not often hear about, and they who also happen to be coming from the global majority or the historically minoritized communities. So that would be one way of decolonizing the curriculum. If we think about the classroom and the classroom dialogue, the classroom discourse, the language of the teacher, then it would be very, very important for the teacher to do the work of identifying problematic language that they themselves perpetuate. And it's a really good exercise to actually look at how problematic language looks like in the mother tongue and in other additional languages the students speak, and also how it would look like in English. And what I mean by problematic language is this sexist, racist, ableist, ageist language that we perpetuate either through idioms or simple expressions that we use, which sometimes end up being rooted in a bias that we might not have been aware of. So it's a really good exercise that the teacher goes through, questioning the socially constructed language that they use and they teach, but also invite the student to reflect on where those biases sit in their own languages or home languages, which they practice on a daily basis. With regard to assessment, actually, I was reading yesterday, preparing for this meeting, this wonderful book called How to Build Your Anti-Racist Classroom by Arlene Badu. And she speaks about an intervention that was made in a school about reading and writing, because they found that Black Caribbean children were falling behind every year in such a systematic way when it came to reading and writing. So what they did was first start by creating reading lists and integrating and decolonizing the curriculum, integrating Black Caribbean authors and also stories that the students could relate to. So they started by integrating literature and stories that the students could relate to, which increased interest and motivation. And when it came to assessment and writing, the students had things to say because they could relate to the content that they have been exposed to. They had very creative ideas. They had also stories they could write about, and the language also developed along the way, which meant that relatability was one way that these teachers have managed to change assessment and also the curriculum to kind of challenge the racial bias that was inherent in the school system out there.
You know, when you're talking about this, I mean, I was thinking of so many challenges that come up when teaching in schools, and motivation is one of the biggest ones. Like, how do you engage your students? How do you get them excited about what they're studying? And thinking about the students I've taught, I think about the transformation that's happened when they've been able to see someone like them in a story. And I think this also relates to that, doesn't it? Students may completely transform overnight because the materials, the language, the tasks are relatable to their world and they feel a part of it.
Yes, if we take the example of museums, for example, and you have an assignment or an item test with where you're asking the student to write about a visit to the museum, the teacher needs to be aware that museums don't look the same everywhere, don't have the same attraction everywhere. So museums in the global north, for example, in Britain, in France, in the US, if you visit them, you will find rooms from different continents where you can to explore different cultures. However, there is a colonial and imperial history that has filled up and led to these rooms to be filled up and led the whole industry of museums to develop and flourish the way it is here in the global north. So when you have an assignment or an activity for students who come from the global south, from these countries that have been colonized by Britain, by France, by Spain, by Portugal, to talk about museums, the relationship that they have with museums is completely different, and the politics of museum in their home country or in their context is completely different. So coloniality is embedded into that. So you end up with students writing fake phrases or sentences about their interest about museums and things like that, and you think like, well, they're not really motivating to do the work, aren't they? They're not working so hard to get the grade that they should be getting to succeed. But relevance, again, is a point here.
So much of what you've talked about today, I mean, it doesn't have to be a teacher acting alone. From what you're describing, this could be teachers sitting down together, having a discussion. You mentioned looking over the curriculum, thinking about where the biases are, thinking about their own language, having these reflective conversations, maybe also involving students in this process. It's not just, we're not asking just one teacher to change everything. It can be conversations that happen. You mentioned like that baby steps, one step at a time, that can make a real big difference.
Yes, especially slow process, long-term, sustainable one is what would have a better impact, in my opinion. However, if we think about quick changes, and again, I am citing here Olin Badu, who speaks about this idea of getting fixes quickly and changing the curriculum quickly. And she advises against that, actually. She says that it should be a school effort because it's a system that we're trying to change. And what happens when individuals try to change systems, those institutions, systems end up changing the society. And therefore, we will be hopefully living in a better world.
Thank you so much, Amina, for your time today and sharing this really practical and inspiring tips. I will include links to your link site and the book you recommended in the show notes. So listeners, you can find that easily in the show notes now. If you have a question that you'd like us to answer or a topic that you'd like us to pitch for the podcast, you can contact us via Facebook, Instagram, or the website tsopop.com. Finally, you can support us by leaving a review and rating wherever you listen to the podcast, by sharing today's episode with your teaching community, or by even buying us a coffee at ko-fi.com/tsopop.